For over 4 decades, the name Franklin Graham carried a kind of weight that very few people in this world ever have to bear. It was not simply a name. It was a legacy. A pulpit. A promise made to millions of believers across America and beyond. And for most of his life, Franklin Graham carried that weight without flinching, without wavering, and without ever letting the public see what was happening underneath. He stood before crowds of thousands, preached in stadiums that shook with the voices of the faithful, and built two of the most powerful Christian organizations on the planet. From the outside, the picture looked almost perfect. A man called by God, shaped by suffering, and driven by purpose. But pictures, as Franklin Graham himself once said, do not always tell the full story. Now, at 73, something has shifted. The man who spent decades telling others to confess, repent, and come clean is finally doing something that nobody in his inner circle expected. He is talking. Really talking. Not the polished, camera-ready version of Franklin Graham that filled television screens and filled arenas. But the real version. The one shaped by rebellion, haunted by private decisions, and quietly burdened by things that never made it into any sermon. The stories he buried in his early years. The tension between enormous wealth and a message built on sacrifice. And one truth he kept folded behind every public appearance for longer than most people would dare to imagine. What he is now saying is not comfortable. It is not the kind of message that gets printed on offering envelopes or stitched onto church banners. It is the kind of truth that costs something to speak. And at 73, Franklin Graham has finally decided that the cost of staying silent is greater than the cost of speaking out. To understand what he is revealing, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to the Crusades, not to the stadiums, not to the headlines. You have to go back to a house in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina, where a little boy grew up in the shadow of the most famous preacher in the world. Where breakfast table conversations included presidents and missionaries. Where the pressure of a global ministry pressed against the walls of what was supposed to be a private family home. That boy was William Franklin Graham III. And from the very first day of his life, the world had already decided who he was supposed to become. The only problem was that nobody asked him. That tension would define everything that followed. Franklin Graham was born on July 14, 1952, the fourth of Billy and Ruth Graham's 5 children. From the outside, the Graham home near Montreat, tucked into the quiet beauty of the Appalachian Mountains, looked like the kind of place where faith came naturally and peace arrived without effort. But that image was a carefully maintained illusion. Because inside those walls, the pressure never really stopped. Billy Graham was not simply a father who happened to preach on weekends. He was a global phenomenon. By the time Franklin was old enough to understand what his father did, Billy Graham had already preached in person to tens of millions of people across more than 185 countries. His face appeared on the cover of Time magazine. Presidents called him for counsel. Crowds gathered in stadiums just to hear him speak. And Franklin watched all of it from close range, from the quiet corner of a living room that doubled as a waiting room for the world. That kind of childhood does something to a person. Not always the thing people expect. The assumption from the outside was that growing up inside the Graham household must have been deeply inspiring, a front row seat to one of the greatest religious movements in modern history. And in some ways, it was. Franklin saw how large-scale ministry worked before most boys his age had figured out how to tie their shoes properly. He watched the timing of crusade choirs, studied the rhythm of his father's delivery, and noticed the way Billy Graham would slow his voice to almost a whisper before inviting people to come forward. He understood the mechanics of mass evangelism not from a textbook but from standing backstage and paying quiet attention. But what that childhood also produced was something far less talked about. Resentment. Deep, stubborn, burning resentment. Because every report card, every friendship, every small mistake carried a question that followed Franklin like a shadow. What would this mean for Billy Graham's son? He was not allowed to simply be a boy. He was always, first and foremost, a reflection. And reflections are not permitted to have bad days, messy rooms, or complicated feelings. Ruth Bell Graham, his mother, carried the daily weight of that household with remarkable strength. Sharp, deeply faithful, and completely unwilling to let her children drift without a fight, she was the one who held the family together while Billy traveled the world. She could edit her husband's sermons with theological precision and then turn around and discipline her children with equal force. Franklin later said that if he were ever going to follow in his father's footsteps, he would first have to get past his mother's knee prints. That single line said more about his upbringing than any biography ever could. The stage was set. The expectations were enormous. And Franklin Graham was already planning his escape. The escape, when it came, was not subtle. Franklin Graham did not quietly drift away from his family's expectations. He walked away from them with both hands in his pockets and a cigarette between his lips. The rebellion started small, the way most rebellions do. A rule bent here, a boundary pushed there. But it grew quickly into something that shocked even those who thought they knew him. He started smoking young, which in itself was enough to send tremors through a household built on the image of moral purity. His mother, in a moment of desperate creativity, tried to cure the habit by forcing him to smoke an entire pack of cigarettes in one sitting. He got sick. He recovered. And then he kept right on smoking. Not because he particularly loved cigarettes, but because nobody was going to tell him what to do. That stubborn refusal to be controlled would define the next decade of his life. By 1970, the situation had moved from manageable to public. Franklin enrolled at Lees McRae College in Banner Elk, North Carolina, but the structure of campus life held no appeal for him. Rules existed to be tested. Curfews existed to be broken. And boundaries existed to show him exactly how far he could push before something gave way. After one semester, he was expelled. The news traveled fast through religious circles, the way bad news always does when it involves someone famous. Billy Graham's son had been thrown out of college. For a young man already struggling beneath the weight of his father's reputation, that failure did not break him. It hardened him. He later admitted that during those years, music, a bottle of scotch, and the freedom to move without anyone watching appealed to him far more than any classroom or church pew ever could. What followed was nearly a decade of restlessness. He moved from place to place, tried different colleges, and found direction in none of them. He used the Graham name when it opened doors and ignored the expectations tied to it when those doors led somewhere he did not want to go. Eventually he landed at Montreat Anderson College, close to his parents' home in North Carolina. Not out of passion for learning, but because it was nearby and the standards were forgiving enough that he could get through without fully committing. By 1974, after years of wandering through higher education like a man killing time in a waiting room, he finished with only a 2-year associate degree. For the son of the most famous preacher in America, it felt like a quiet but unmistakable verdict. This was not a man on his way to greatness. This was a man who had not yet found a single reason to try. But Franklin Graham would be the first to tell you that what looked like failure from the outside was actually something else entirely. It was a man being emptied out. Made ready. The emptying out reached its lowest point in 1974, and it happened not in a church, not at a crusade, and not at his mother's kitchen table. It happened in a hotel room in Jerusalem, alone, with a bottle of scotch on the nightstand and no particular plan for the evening. Franklin had been traveling through Europe and the Middle East, still living the same restless, untethered life that had defined his early 20s. He was 22 years old, carrying the most recognized surname in American Christianity, and feeling about as far from God as a person could get while still technically believing he existed. Because that was the strange and painful truth of Franklin Graham's rebellion. It was never really about disbelief. He had seen too much of his father's world to dismiss the message as fiction. He had watched hundreds of thousands of people walk forward at crusades. He had heard the gospel preached with a power that moved entire stadiums to silence. He knew the words. He understood the theology. His problem, as he would later admit with brutal honesty, was not atheism. It was pride. He simply did not want to hand control of his life to anyone. Not even God. But something shifted that night in Jerusalem. Before going out, he sat down and opened the Gospel of John. He read through chapter 3, the conversation between Jesus and Nicodemus about what it means to be born again. He had heard that passage hundreds of times. He could probably have recited it from memory. But that night, alone in a foreign city with no audience to perform for and no reputation left to protect, the words stopped being familiar. They became personal. They stopped describing something that happened to other people and started describing exactly what he needed. He closed the book, got off the chair, and knelt on the floor of that hotel room. And in the quiet of that Jerusalem night, Franklin Graham finally stopped running. What happened next moved quickly. He returned to North Carolina and made his changed life visible in the most public way available to him. He married his childhood friend Jane Austen Cunningham on his parents' front lawn. To the watching world of evangelical Christianity, it looked like the prodigal son had finally come home. But the real transformation was not the wedding or the public declaration. It was what happened shortly after, when a man named Bob Pierce entered his life with an invitation that would permanently change the direction of everything. Pierce, the intense and visionary founder of Samaritan's Purse and World Vision, saw in Franklin something worth investing in. In 1975, he took him on a 6-week journey through some of the hardest mission fields in Asia. What Franklin saw there broke something open inside him that the Jerusalem hotel room had only begun to crack. Refugee camps. Leprosy colonies. Children searching through garbage for food. War-scarred villages where pastors had paid with their bodies for the right to believe. Faith, Franklin Graham suddenly understood, was never meant to be only a sermon. It was meant to be something you could hand to a starving child. That revelation became the foundation on which Franklin Graham built everything that followed. When Bob Pierce died of leukemia on September 6, 1978, Samaritan's Purse was still a small and struggling organization with limited reach and uncertain future. Franklin was young, barely in his mid-20s, and the memory of his expelled, wandering, Scotch-drinking years was still fresh in the minds of many who watched him step forward. But in 1979, he became president of Samaritan's Purse anyway. And what he did with that small, fragile organization over the decades that followed became one of the most remarkable institutional transformations in the history of American Christianity. Emergency field hospitals appeared in Ebola zones across West Africa. Rapid response teams landed in Haiti after the earthquake, in Italy during the early chaos of COVID, and in Ukraine after the Russian invasion began. Operation Christmas Child, launched in the early 1990s with the simple idea of packing a shoebox with gifts for a child in need, grew into a global pipeline that by 2023 had delivered more than 200 million boxes to children in over 100 countries. The rebellious boy who could not finish a semester of college had built a humanitarian empire that circled the entire planet. But empires, even Christian ones, cast long shadows. And as Samaritan's Purse grew, so did the questions that followed Franklin Graham everywhere he went. By 2008, public filings revealed that his combined compensation from Samaritan's Purse and the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association had reached approximately $1.2 million in a single year. Watchdog groups pointed to the number immediately. Here was a man who preached sacrifice from some of the world's biggest stages, who asked ordinary families to pack shoeboxes and donate their modest incomes to relief work while personally collecting a salary that placed him among the highest-paid charity executives in the United States. Franklin answered his critics by defending the figure as reasonable for someone managing organizations of that scale. His supporters agreed. His opponents were not satisfied. And the tension between the message he preached and the life those salaries suggested never fully went away. Neither did the controversy surrounding his public statements. From the moment he called Islam a very evil and wicked religion on national television in November 2001, just 2 months after the September 11 attacks, Franklin Graham made it clear that he had no interest in the careful, diplomatic tone his father had carefully cultivated over decades. He praised Vladimir Putin's anti-LGBTQ stance in Russia while human rights organizations documented beatings and abductions under the same laws he was applauding. He attacked Wheaton College professors, condemned Pride Month on social media, and defended Donald Trump through scandals that made even some conservative allies uncomfortable. When Trump posted an AI-generated image resembling Jesus in April 2026, Franklin stepped forward to dismiss the outrage as much ado about nothing, drawing sharp criticism even from within his own political circle. And yet, at 73, Franklin Graham does not apologize. He does not soften. He does not look back at the hotel room in Jerusalem and wonder if a different man might have walked a gentler road. He says he will keep preaching these hard truths for as long as he has the breath and the strength to speak them. The rebellious son became the unyielding father of a movement. And what he is finally revealing now, after all these years, is something far more unsettling than a secret. It is the unfiltered truth of a man who decided, long ago in a foreign city on his knees, that he would never again live for anyone's approval. Not the world's. Not the church's. And not even, if it came to that, his own famous father's. Franklin Graham is still running. Only now, for the first time in his life, he is absolutely certain of where he is going.